Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Coaching the Bible. This is episode 255, season 5, episode 42. Our topic of the week is on the gravity of influence. We're talking a lot about the subject of influence. Do not try to adjust your audio. This is actually how I sound this week. Very congested, very much under the weather. Came back from the U.S. after visiting with my mom post her surgery, going to the wedding of a son of a good friend, old friend, and a lot of shopping with a nasty, nasty cold. So do not try to adjust. This is just me. This is how we roll. We try not to miss a week. And even in a week when I'm really not feeling well, we're going to do the episode. So our topic of the week is on the gravity of influence. Influence is everywhere. Once it was the case that influence was something subtle. So it was a mentor whose wisdom would shape you, the teacher whose voice you might still hear in your head, the parent whose values become your moral compass. We talked about that actually fairly recently. Today, influence is an industry. And social media didn't just come along and amplify influence. It put it on display, it monetized it, and now it's measured. And now influencer is a job title. Imagine back when we went to school in the 90s, telling somebody you're going to be an influencer. That's going to be your job. You're going to get paid a lot of money for that. And the amazing part of that, the part that I think puzzles a lot of people, is trying to appreciate and understand, why does that work? How does that work? What makes it work? Why would someone trust a stranger on TikTok more than they say, no, more than maybe $1 million ad campaign? But yet we see it everywhere. Skincare brands outpacing the ad agencies with a TikToker. A peanut butter brand exploding from obscurity to going from a very small amount of monthly revenue to hundreds of thousands of monthly revenue because of social media ads and the use and the marketing of influencers. Even travel retreats, which I read about, where an influencer, social media personality was going to be attending in person, getting people to pay money to hang out with that person, a single trusted influencer voice. It's amazing. Influence works because the truth is it feels very personal, it's repeatable, and it's quite relational. Psychologists call it a parasocial bond, a one-sided relationship where people feel they know the influencer. If you add in then a splice of repetition, storytelling, and some identity signals, suddenly that person isn't just content somewhere out in the world. They become a trusted guide. It's an amazing thing. I think the same thing is true with, podcasts that you listen to, not necessarily this one, but other ones where you have almost a quote unquote connection with the person who's the host of the podcast. You feel like you know them because they're in your ears on a consistent, regular basis. I have that vibe when I listen to the recordings weekly of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs. Hearing the person's voice in your ears, having their sound resonate in your mind, stays with you. It influences how you think and how you feel, and perhaps how you react. And here's the kicker part of all that we just talked about. It's actually not really new. The Bible already knows this, and Moses is already talking about this in this week's portion. He is not trying to be an influencer in the way we think about it today. He's certainly not trying to be followed. He's really trying to be remembered. He does repeat things. He does reframe things. He does set conditions. Teach them diligently, he tells us. Repeat them when you rise, when you lie down, and so on and so forth. He's going towards formation of the people and the nation. He wants his voice to be embedded into people's lives way long after he is gone. But more than his own voice, the voice of God, the commandments, the faith, the covenant, all of that. And so when you read the portion this week, the portion known as Re'eh, it actually feels quite modern, because Re'eh isn't just about ancient laws and ritual. It's about the forces that shape who you listen to, who you trust, and then by extension, who you become. So let's take a look at 3 examples of influence in this week's portion. Number one, excuse me, as I said, I'm under the weather, so breathing is hard a little bit. 15th chapter of Deuteronomy. The Bible tells us a direct warning. There will come charismatic figures, dreamers, even maybe miracle workers who will rise and try to persuade you to chase other gods. Obviously, we are commanded not to follow them. That's obvious. But we have to appreciate what's at the core of that idea. The idea here that influence should be recognized as something potentially very powerful and also dangerously seductive. And the Bible's message is blunt. Not all influence is good, and some must be resisted even when it looks compelling. Number two, blessings and curses. We've talked about the idea of framing and reframing before. The portion opens with the idea that Moses is setting before the people the choice between blessing and curse. He sets up a frame or structure. The future is binary. Blessing for obedience, curses for rebellion. This is framing, and framing is by definition a form of influence. He is shaping perception, decision-making by presenting very stark alternatives. It's not about coercion. He's not trying to coerce, but about how choices are narrated and weighted and understood and appreciated. So that's number two. Number three is something I don't think we think of as influence, but memory and ritual as anchors. This is in the 12th chapter and beyond. So instructions for festivals and centralized worship, repetition of laws is actually influence because it influences through the mechanism of repetition and ritual, teaching people to remember, to reenact, to internalize their identity, year after year after year. So that is an influence. The influence isn't something that happens just once. It actually requires on some level repetition and anchoring at the essence of the person or in the person to actually have the influence that it wants to actually create. Sorry, I'm repeating words. And what does it then therefore say if the Bible is telling us over and over and over again about the different kinds of influences that exist in the world? The Bible is telling us, therefore, that we should have as the assumption that this next generation, that generation that Moses is speaking to, is vulnerable to influence. That generation would be hit much harder by influence than the generation that was in the desert itself. Why? Because prosperity that they're coming in with brings seduction. Neighboring nations bring pressure, new ideas. Charismatic leaders potentially bring risk. So Moses calls it out. He teaches a core counter principle, and he embeds a counter influence to what we could call a preloaded resilience. He's building up resilience on the front side of that so that they can be ready for the influence as it comes. So he's naming the influence as a real power. False prophets can be convincing. Don't kid yourself. False gods, same idea. He's teaching that discernment that we talked about a few weeks ago. Miracles or charisma aren't proof of truth. Influence must be tested against values. So let's build up the value set. Let's appreciate, learn, repeat, enact with our value set and our commandment set, so that when we come up against these other influences, we have to pressure test them. And then he's embedding the counter influence through ritual and the framing of blessings versus curses and memory practices, that preloading that resilience into the people so they have anchors when influence comes knocking, because influence will come knocking. A then tells us that leadership, this is a leadership model for people who are going to live in an influence-saturated world like the world we live in now, same as the world they lived in then. And it's not an if question. It's how you will filter and respond when the influence comes. You will be influenced. And now it warns against those seductions and provides the reframing choices for moral weight and the embedded protective rituals. So you can't escape the influence. You have to learn better how to recognize it, resist it when it's false, and reinforce what influences are true. And so the science of influence is actually then very interesting. It's important to appreciate how it works, what's actually occurring inside the mental mind in that. And modern psychology has really spent decades unpacking what the portion of the Bible already anticipated. Influence is powerful, predictable, and often visible. So we're just going to share a couple of principles today. We can't get into all of them. There are a lot that really get at the core of this, at the heart of this. Number one, we're going to start with sort of two streams at the same time. We're going to start with Robert Cialdini, who we've mentioned recently and then way back in the past because of his work on persuasion and his book on influence. I recommend it. And then some classic social psychology experiments that really help to appreciate the different levers that are at play in shaping our behavior. And so here's number one, social proof. People assume that if others are doing it, it must be right. This is the term that Cialdini coined, which is social proof. If other people are doing it, it must be right. Solomon Asch, who studied group pressure and conformity, most famously through his experiment called the line test, proved in a lab when people denied their own eyes just to align with group opinion. So here was the test. You had a group of people who were actors and one person who was the participant who didn't know that the other group were actors. They were given two pieces of paper, essentially, that had lines on them. On one, there was one line, and on the second one was three lines, each of different lengths. One of the three lines was the same length as the quote-unquote test on the first piece of paper. All the actors got it wrong on purpose, and it forced, effectively, the person who was the participant to also choose the wrong answers simply because they wanted to line up with group opinion. They were influenced. Their opinion was influenced. Truth was changed because of the group dynamic. So influence doesn't always look like force. It sometimes can look simply just like people nodding in a certain direction and you nodding along, people going along with something, even though it may not be true, because of social proof. And so the Bible warns against following the majority into idolatry. Popular doesn't equal true. Number two is authority. We are wired to defer to credible voices. So Cialdini showed how uniforms, titles, and credentials increase compliance. Simply by putting on the white coat of a doctor, you are more likely to be listened to than if you're not wearing the white coat. Stanley Milgram, who studied obedience, famously with his rather extreme experiment on electric shock treatments to undeserving participants, revealed how authority can push ordinary people into extraordinary actions for good or for harm. In his experiment, he basically had a person who was applying electric shock to somebody who didn't deserve it simply because they got a wrong answer to a question and because it was a third person telling this person to apply the electric shock. Now, caveat, the person actually wasn't being shocked. They were faking it. But the person who was being told to do this continued to do this because the person they were listening to was, quote unquote, the authority in the room. The Bible then tells us that Moses is warning against prophets who dazzle with signs but are misleading effectively in intent, and charisma or credentials aren't in fact proof of anything, let alone proof of the truth. And then here's the last one that I'll share with you today, narrative and first story. So there's a neuroscientist named Paul Zak who shows through his work on stories that when people hear compelling narratives, there's an oxytocin spike in the brain, in the body, making us more likely to act. So the story bypasses our skepticism and wires directly into our memory and our emotion. And so often the first story wins. So the initial frame locks perception into place. If you're questioning as to why some of the narratives and some of the storylines in the current environment stick, it's because they were first and they were compelling, even though they weren't true. They created a reaction. They inspired or triggered a reaction in the listener. And now it's almost impossible to remove or embed a different version of that story, even though it's not true. Israel, therefore, is reminded repeatedly of its story. You were slaves in Egypt. The narrative then is not just history alone. It's an identity anchor, and it continues to influence behavior over and over again for years upon millennia. And so the modern research confirms what the Bible was already telling us and already knew. Influence isn't neutral. influence is a lever. Sometimes it's pulling in one way, sometimes it's pulling another way, but someone is always pulling it. The leader's task then, you the leader, isn't to escape influence, but to notice it, filter it, and wield it with integrity. Now, that said, there is a positive side to this as well. Because if influence is negative, it can also be positive because by itself, it's neutral. And so we have to think as leaders, not just about the negative side of influence, but on the positive side of influence. How do we build the right kind of influence? How do we embed the right type of gravity with the influence that we're trying to present? And so through ritual and repetition and story, the Bible, in fact, is trying to embed protective influence. And the same idea then comes up through the psychology as well. Here's just one great example. It's called the trust effect, or credibility compounds. A 2019 Harvard study found employees who trusted leadership were 50% more productive and 76% more engaged. That was purely because of trust. Trust here is the currency of the influence. Trust beats charisma because the consistency compounds into gravity. Because I trust and I trust and I trust, it leads me to a certain level of faithfulness and therefore a certain kind of behavior. And same thing with the Bible. The rituals of faithfulness remind Israel that God is trustworthy. Every festival then, or every ritual in that direction, is a deposit into that trust bank. Get the idea of what we're talking about. I'll just share one more idea here as well in terms of the positive side. So model is greater than message. This is like a mirroring effect. Dr. Albert Bandura, who was a psychologist at Stanford University, proved people imitate what they see more than what they hear. Kids who watched adults act aggressively with a toy mirrored that behavior themselves. Adults aren't that much different. Leaders broadcast, therefore, in every choice. So the modeling of behavior is greater than the message. It's not simply, do as I say, not as I do. We're going to do as you do more than what you say. That's important to appreciate. Moses, therefore, models that level of obedience and is effectively aiming at reframing memory and establishing how memory should be perceived, and his consistency of behavior and action becomes the people's pattern. On some level, we want to be Moses, not simply because he was who he was, but as a result, or by extension, the message comes through by virtue of the model that brought the message. And so positive influence can and should be intentional. You don't want to just simply resist the negative or the wrong voices. You want to actively cultivate the right ones so that they're louder, and therefore they are the ones that are listened to when gravity is pushed down upon the person. Which brings us, therefore, then to that principle we spoke about a few weeks ago called discernment, which I think you can call the leader's filter. Influence may be everywhere, but discernment then is call it the salve or the medicine that decides which ones you will allow in. So what do? How do you work through the idea that if influence is unavoidable, whether you'll notice it, filter it, and align it or align properly with your own values? So a few weeks ago, we talked about discernment. We talked about it with respect to vows and promises. We framed discernment there around the promises, self-mastery, knowing when to keep or when to release a vow. Here, discernment shifts outward into boundary setting. Who are we letting in to shape our world? Which voices are we giving authority in our life for ourselves, for our teams, for our community? And Moses isn't saying ignore influence. He's saying, I'm setting before you blessings and curses. He's warning of prophets who dazzle but mislead, the neighboring nations who will entice but also corrupt, the cultures whose rituals will tug at your heart but will move you away. He's saying, hey, man, recognize the influence as a force that could tilt either way. And together, the inner discernment and the external discernment, promises versus influence, form that level of leadership maturity that is anchored from within and is quite discerning from without. But discernment can't just be theory. We talked about it a few weeks ago with a specific set of tools. Here, let's share a couple more that I think really resonate in perhaps a different way to help you discern better. So number one is what I'm calling the 5-voice audit. List the 5 voices you hear most often in a week: spouse, friends, colleagues, podcasts, books, news feeds. Then look at how your behavior, your actions, your voice, your words mirror the habits and the moods of the people that you're around. Awareness is your first filter. The same idea that when we think about, the 5 people that are around us, show me who your 5 best friends are, and I'll show you who you are. The reason why that's true is because of the influence that those 5 people have on you. Because the voices that you permit in are the future, effectively, that you will inherit. So the 5-voice audit. Those could be good, those could be bad. It's just a question of appreciating what they are. Number 2, and I think in the religious communities, we do this quite naturally, is what I'll call the influence fast. Step back from one dominant source of influence for a set period of time. Maybe it's a week off of Instagram, a month of not speaking to a specific advisor in your life. Maybe it's skipping a month worth of podcasts from a certain person that you listen to on a regular basis. That fasting, which is effectively in this space of silence, can reveal both your level of dependence on that influence and allows other overlooked voices to step to the fore. So digital detox, which is a version of this, show people with lower stress and a clearer focus within a few days, because stepping away shows you what's actually really steering you on a day-to-day basis. That's 2. Number 3, this is the last one, and then we're almost done. What I'll call feedback triangulation. When considering a big move, so this is influence that you are inviting, gather perspectives from 3 very different circles. Example, a mentor, a peer, and someone outside of your world completely. And then look at how those 3 things come together, triangulate those different voices, cross-check between them to reduce the blind spots that exist and to mitigate any sort of echo chamber that might come into play or an overload of influence from one specific voice. The truth is, wisdom comes from more than just one angle. And so by allowing the triangulation of the feedback from multiple sources, you are allowing yourself the opportunity to reduce some of the friction or some of the issues that come with an overload of influence from one place and allow other of those voices into the space. To me, these aren't abstract tools. These are behaviors, practices that are repeatable for you as a leader that you can share with other people on your team, and they help to build up that muscle of discernment, the ability to filter and to prune and to balance and to slow down so the influences work for you and not against you. So as the nation is about to enter the land, a conversation around influence is crucial and vital. They have seen what happens when other nations come around them and the behaviors that come there, but it wasn't discussed at the time. Now it's being talked. And when we think about the influences in our own lives, for better or for worse, enhancing and increasing and working on our level of discernment can only make us minimally more aware, but maximally perhaps more proactive in the manner in which we are allowing influence and creating influence in our lives. To close it out with a quote, this is a quote from Angelou. People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. Seems like an off quote, it's not. Influence lasts because it shapes the feeling and not just the thought. And Maya Angelou's quote reminds us that influence isn't about argument. It's about the impression we leave behind. That is Coaching the Bible for this week. As always, wishing you an extraordinary, beautiful, and incredibly amazing weekend ahead. And look forward to seeing you next week for episode 256. Have a good one.